Hello listeners, Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are tuned to the Nighttime Podcast, focused on the fringe of Canada.
If you spend much time rubbing elbows in Canada's literary circles, you may be familiar with tonight's guest. Andrew Pyper is an award-winning Canadian author who has gained a reputation for having writing as rock solid as it is creepy. His novels can be found on bestsellers lists and literary award ceremonies both in Canada and abroad. But as impressive and as interesting as the life and craft of a rock star writer is, I invited Andrew here today to talk about something altogether different. See, something happened to Andrew Pyper last summer. It happened during a weekend spent at his cottage in rural Ontario. Andrew saw a UFO, and his life has never been the same. After coming to terms with what he saw and how it has affected him, Andrew wrote a very moving opinion piece in the Globe and Mail titled, "I Saw a UFO Last Summer. I Haven't Been the Same Since." I invited him to the show to share his story and his experience with nighttime listeners. And that's what we're about to hear. In tonight's episode, we will be joined by author Andrew Pyper for a discussion surrounding his UFO sighting and the lasting effects it has had on him. Let's just start with an introduction. Tell me a little bit about who you are and some of your background.
Sure, yeah, I live in Toronto, where I am now, and I am a novelist. So I've been writing fiction full-time for the last, 23, 24 years. Prior to that, I was trained I went to law school, but I never practiced law. I did enough law to recognize that I didn't want to make my living at that. So, and I was been very, very lucky to be able to make my living writing fiction since then. So, but born and raised in Southern Ontario in a small town, and have always been interested in a kind of a not quite scholarly way, but a lot of my novels do employ elements of the supernatural or the paranormal or the fantastical in some way. But so I've been kind of an amateur student of the strange for a long time.
Nice. I know it's not every day that a best-selling author writes an opinion piece in a major Canadian newspaper sharing their personal UFO encounter or sighting. When this happened to you and you made the decision to write about it, publicly like that, was there any concern in your mind about how people would view you or view this encounter?
Yes. The short answer is yes. And I think, frankly, if this had happened to me and I considered this very question you've put to me now 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I might have been like, look, it's not worth it. I didn't make anything from writing the piece. It's not furthering my career in any way. But I'm just now, I guess, at a point in my career and maybe a point in my life where I don't care what potential kind of, how some people might view this or something like that. And secondly, I am secure in the position that it's true, that what I experience is true. I'm not, so when you're fortified by the truth and when you're fortified by your confidence in your own testimony as a witness to something, then a lot of the potential kind of noise goes away.
Mm-hmm. As well, I don't know how closely you follow the topic of UFOs, but it's looked at slightly different now than it was even 5 or 10 years ago, where it seems a bit more credible of a topic, yet still coming forward publicly is going to get some odd looks from people. And what you did when you released this, I guess I would just call it an opinion piece. Millions of people in Canada have seen, your face and your name in an article about a UFO sighting. Like, before we get into what you actually saw and the effect it had on you, what did friends and family think of, you coming forward with something like this?
Well, it's interesting, they're kind of, I guess they're more or less used to, I'm the sort of the one artist of the family, and I come from a family that is primarily scientists and medical practitioners of one kind or another. And so they're like, well, here's Andrew, not so much here's Andrew going off again, but that my interests in these areas has always been, sort of counterintuitive to their inclinations. And so it was less coming from them than, frankly, the greater response has been from complete strangers who have very deeply held preconceived notions about these topics, whether they are absolutist kind of believers in UFOs are vehicles from a planet, and they are aliens who are visiting us, etc. And that one particular rabbit hole, or the oppositional rabbit hole, which is, this is complete nonsense. There are ways to explain this, and let me explain it for you. I'm going to explain your experience to you. That was the not quite equal to it, to be honest. I would say probably the response that I received directly, personally, has been 80%. Wow, that's amazing. I've had experiences a lot like that, and 20% saying, you didn't have the experience you think you had. I'll tell you what you saw.
Interesting. Well, let's get into what actually happened. So we're set the scene for me. Where is it that you were when you had this experience?
I was at our cottage, where we have, in the last sort of 4 years, developed I bought a piece of vacant land in as remote a place as I could find. I really wanted a place where I could work and where I could bring my family and quiet. So this is a lake about 2.5 hours north of Kingston, Ontario. So it's quite remote, Eastern Ontario, Canadian Shield, mix of trees, old forest, and it's a lake that is very quiet. We would have on the Canada Day weekend, at the peak of the afternoon, if it was sunny, you might see 2 fishing boats out there and guys just quietly, having a beer and casting a line. It's and I love it for all those reasons. So it was there, and it was an even quieter time of the year. It was early September, and my friend and I, a friend that I've had since grade school, we played hockey together. We were in a rock band together in high school. I've known this guy forever. We were up there for a weekend together, just, sort of hanging out. And this evening, we were sitting by the fire. It was sort of a slightly cooler evening. Sitting by the fire, it was that time of year where there was no mosquitoes, no bugs. We were just sitting out. It was a beautiful evening. And I was facing, our cottage is located on a point. So you can sort of, the lake is around you 3 sides. So I'm looking out the sort of south-facing part of the point. So to my left would have been the east, and about a 2 hours drive away is Ottawa, and to my right is the west, and sort of Toronto is 4 hours away this way. So we were sitting by the fire, and we weren't talking about anything. We were talking about old sort of high school funny stories, like who you went to the prom with, whatever happened to this person, that person, that kind of recollection you have with old pals. And I felt, it's very hard to describe, but I felt a sensation that I've just sort of now come to just term a strangeness. There was a strange moment of awareness, and it wasn't fear. It wasn't like, how sometimes people say that there's that sensation of being watched, or you turn around and you have a spooky feeling. It wasn't like that, but there was almost a suspension of the moment. A little bit like, when you're walking and you feel the environment change before a rain comes. It was analogous to that. And it drew my attention. I was aware of something to my left prior to my seeing something to my left. So within the space of perhaps, this is all happening within maybe 3 or 4 seconds, a feeling, a strangeness, a sort of an internal clocking of, oh, something strange is happening in this environment. And then a visual sense of something to my left, a bright light. but the bright light wasn't perceived. That is to say, it wasn't like I was bathed in light. There wasn't that, but I was aware of, oh, there's a light to my left. It was almost distracting without it again being physically. So my friend, for example, didn't see any of this. He was not aware of the strange feeling, nor was he aware of the light that I felt. But it drew my attention to the left, to the east, and I immediately saw in the sky above the lake an orb. So it initially presented as a circular sort of pie shape of a dull yellowish, brownish, but it changed. It was constantly changing color of light. The orb was not huge. It would have been, if it had been a full moon, for example, it might have been double that, perhaps triple the size of a full moon, but certainly not mistakable for the moon, nor a planet, nor a star. It was immediately presented as, that's not a heavenly body of any kind. It's something else. And I said to my friend, what's that? And he saw it immediately too. And so it was at that point that he, joined me in the testimony of seeing this thing. And from there we just watched it. We watched it change. It changed both in shape. It had a certain almost organic quality to it. So again, it wasn't sort of like a fixed, here's a circle moving. It was as it moved, it sort of changed shape. It bent, it undulated, it stretched, and it dropped from whatever its initial altitude was. It was very hard to determine its distance from where we were, because it was hard to determine its size, from where we were. I would guess it would have been, just beyond the end of our lake, which is roughly a couple of kilometers long.
Okay.
It dropped down initially sort of slowly, and then quite quickly down in a way that I would say would be impossible, more than possible for any kind of aircraft, fighter aircraft. It was not a helicopter, certainly, and even a drone would not have that kind of the variation in distance. It wouldn't have that capacity. And as it was dropping, small sort of secondary, small points of light came out from it and left briefly in the night sky, etchings, almost like sort of, if you imagine sort of taking a pin to a blackboard, just sort of little lines that then disappeared, dropped down, rose up at a very quickly at a diagonal, and then shot off at a impossible rate.
Was there any, aside from seeing the object in the sky, did you hear anything or see its light, lighting up what was below it, or did it seem to just affect, the sky that it was appearing in?
There was no sound whatsoever. It was a very quiet lake, as I mentioned, and it was a very quiet night. So quiet that you could hear, and we did hear at earlier points, that a neighbor, by neighbor I mean at the far end of the lake, it's his dog, uttering a bark, and that would have been, prior to this, the loudest thing of the night. And so you could have heard anything, and it made no sound whatsoever. And no, there was no secondary sort of ambient light that emitted from it, but it demonstrated changes in its colorations, and almost like, again, internally, I found fascinating is, as I was watching it, was the nature of the light itself. It wasn't like a headlight, which is like a steady shape and a steady mass or volume or quantity of light. It altered in shape, as well as the quality of the light, as well as the shaping within the light. So it almost was like, at certain points, looking into the iris of someone's eye, or those kind of striations and lines within the light, all of which are, I think, remove it from the possibility of it being a drone or, frankly, any other aircraft.
Yeah, and at the same time, its size would kind of, lead you away from thinking, it's a far off aircraft or drone or whatnot. But aside from trying to guess now what it may have been at the time, what did you have any idea of what you were looking at? Like, what were your first kind of, after it disappears or flies off or whatnot, your friend and you and your friend, like, what did you think you had seen?
I think I said that was a UFO. Again, not from the point of view of that was an alien craft, or there was no sense of, I certainly, and I still don't have a conviction about what it was or where it came from. But it was very clear to me and to my friend, we had both agreed immediately, in answer to your question, we were both in immediate agreement of that was really weird. That
something special.
Absolutely. Yeah. Neither of us attempted, and nor would we attempt to explain it away, because it was so clearly inexplicable as against would have been the normal catalog of normal things you'd see in the sky. So there was an initial kind of just confirmation between the two of us of that was a UFO. We are now those people that, you sort of hear about who have, seen something strange in the sky. We've now entered that club of people who have had that experience.
Now, in your piece that you wrote for the Globe and Mail, you kind of got into the idea of seeing it wasn't really what had the impact on you immediately, but really like kind of the after effect of having experienced something so strange left this massive, change on your life. Can you tell me a bit about how it went from, I saw something weird to I now look at the world in a different way? Like, what led to this having such a big impact on, how you see things?
Well, I think it's, as I was mentioning, I make my living writing fiction that deals, I've never written about UFOs or aliens or anything of that kind, but broadly speaking, the aspects of existence that are, supernatural or paranormal in one way or another. So I've always been fascinated by this, but I've never had an experience that would even buttress the real possibility of any of those things. And so it felt to me like, a rip in the fabric or an intrusion from, the other side that announced itself. There's so little that and by you, I mean us collectively, that there is, to me, it was a signal of, and I don't mean this is a message from an extraterrestrial. I don't know where it comes from, but from my takeaway is from the experience is that it was a reminder of how little we understand about what we call reality. That these rules that we cling to, and I understand why we cling to them, because it's a frightening thing for many of us to even contemplate that we are deeply ignorant about the overall operations of the universe and consciousness and ourselves. That can be potentially kind of an abyss that we don't want to spend too much time standing at the edge of. So instead we say, no, these are the rules of reality. These are things that are possible. These are impossible. And if you're going to introduce the impossible, I'm going to mock that or dismiss it or turn my back on it. But for me, it was a humbling, and again, I would say humbling in the sense of there is so much that I don't know about even the operations of something like the sky, myself, the world, time, where we are. That it's almost like every kind of small, secure, foundational, metaphysical idea upon which your existence, your life, your family, your job, your habits are built is far more wobbly than perhaps you're more comfortable in assuming.
Yeah, but I think overall, though, I'm not going to speak for you, but I think as someone myself who seeks out these stories and uses them to kind of spice up the world and reality. I see it as a positive thing where it's so easy to get lost in like the 9 to 5 grind, paying your mortgage, paying this bill, paying that bill, waiting in lineups for things. When something that kind of changes the game, like a story like this that you can't explain, that's just like a huge reminder and a wake-up call that there is like magic out there. And maybe it's not, something that happens every single day, but it still exists. And I think that's exciting. And maybe that's why I personally enjoy these kind of stories so much. But I think like in reading your article, I kind of got the sense that was a similar effect it had on you, is just, a wake up call that, there's a lot more to the world than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. That's very well put. And I agree. And I guess there's a certain hopefulness that comes with the acknowledgement of one's limitation in knowledge, that as much as you're sort of, I thought we had these rules of physics. I thought we had an understanding of how this works and what's impossible and impossible. But when you're freed from that, with that liberty comes an enormous new space of possibility. Mm-hmm. And it invites, I think, the engagement of less kind of, I need proof. There is a certain inclination among many, perhaps a majority, of, look, I'm not going to believe it until I get proof, right? And
where was Andrew's camera? Why did he pull his camera out?
Right. And on that point, very quickly, I will say, because a couple of people have said, like, look, what, if it was so apparent, and we both, my friend and I, had our cameras in our pockets, as all of us do today, constantly. It never once occurred to either of us until after the fact to pull out our camera, to pull out our phones. We were too involved in the moment to do that. Now, maybe if we were, 14-year-olds, it would have been, the phones were out, but it never occurred to us. But returning to, your earlier question, I think as much as there's sort of on the demand on on one hand for prove it to me. And once you prove it to me, I will accept it. There's another way of coming at these things that I think you've anticipated, which is, no. Let's maybe sort of yield ourselves to some kind of like challenge and proof, and open ourselves to possibility and imagination. Mm-hmm. So, what could this be? On what basis do I form my certainties? How secure am I in my presumed certainties of what is space, what is here, what is memory, what is past and future? Like that, I find the latter far more exciting. So when you yield yourself to how little you know, it opens up a much wider possibility to what you could know, perhaps later, perhaps as a species at one time, as opposed to, I know these things, and if you're going to insert a new fact into this silo of things I know, you must, climb a mountain and sort of, prove it to me about to this court of one. That silo is never going to enlarge. So I prefer, without sort of being a believer, I prefer the position of openness.
Sorry to interrupt the episode like this, but I want to take a moment and tell you about something I just posted to the Nighttime Premium feed. But for those unfamiliar, let me start by letting you know that there is a separate and much better Nighttime podcast feed than the one you're listening to now. It's available exclusively at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. The premium feed, however, does cost about as much as a bag of chips, but it's more satisfying than a salty crunch ever will be. First, the premium feed funds the creation of this show. So if you enjoy Nighttime, you have the patron subscribers to thank for keeping it alive. Secondly, the premium feed is much less annoying. Since it's listener funded, there's no ads like this or any of the others you've heard during the episode. And lastly, but most importantly, the premium feed includes many premium feed exclusives that you won't find here on the free feed. Shortly after the release of this episode, I'll be releasing the audio from an event I hosted alongside my pal Donnie called Ghost Night. During this premium feed episode, you'll hear Donnie and I share personal ghost stories, You will hear listeners phone in and share their ghost stories, and you'll hear us read some of our favorites. So if you're into stories of the supernatural, this bonus content may be right up your alley. If you want to subscribe to the Nighttime Premium feed, visit patreon.com/nighttime podcast. I should also mention all annual subscribers will receive a Nighttime Welcome swag pack. So again, go premium at patreon.com/nighttime podcast. Now let's get back to the episode. In your piece, you end with this thought of your mind or the message from them or from whatever you saw, instead of being "we're here" to being "you're here." Can you kind of describe that concept? Because I thought it was a real beautiful way to end the article you wrote.
Oh, thanks. Well, I think a lot of times people, when they have experiences of this kind, are asked, well, if it is, let's say, extraterrestrials or something from another place, why are they here? What could their motivation possibly be? What are they trying to say to you? And while I understand that line of questioning, it's a rational line of questioning, it puts the focus on the thing. It puts the focus on the thing, the visitor, as opposed to the witness. And that perhaps these experiences, as much as they invite us to speculate as to why this thing happened, I think the more interesting and immediate possible effect could be, who am I? Who am I in this world? Why do what are the things that shape consciousness? Those are very challenging. Those are obviously very big, challenging questions. But that's the thing that I left this experience with. Far more interestingly, to my mind, than Andrew, what do you think it was? A lot of people asking, do you think it was aliens? Do you think it was a ship? Do you think it was a secret military operation? Like, I don't know. I really don't know. But I find that sort of cluster of questions far less interesting than the question of, having had an experience of this kind, who am I? Who am I in the relationship with all the things that I know and don't know?
Wow. And now you're well known for writing some pretty far out fiction. Is this kind of personal experience, do you think this is going to have an effect on the characters you write in the stories that are experiencing these bizarre things? Like your latest book is like a haunting in the White House. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
I can only imagine writing fictional situations where people are experiencing this bizarre stuff could only be changed by having experienced something yourself. What impact is this going to have on your writing?
I don't know. It's interesting because a lot of my fiction prior to this has been about, in one way or another, the question of conviction and belief and being alone in a particular point of view and having powers or people around you who are challenging that or refusing to accept it. And I think prior to this experience, what was interesting me, and over the course of writing these books, was I would give readings a lot, and before COVID, of course, I did a lot of public appearances, and invariably at each one of these, there would be at least one, if not a number of people who would come up to me afterwards and say, I want to, I saw a ghost. I lived in a haunted house. I had a confrontation with a demonic entity. I saw a UFO, whatever their experience was. And these people were and are, like me, I think, reasonable, educated, rational, sober, of sound mind. And they told their stories always with almost a tone of apology, like, look, I know this sounds crazy, or I'm not trying to I'm not trying to convince you of anything. All I'm telling you is what happened to me. And that body of evidence, that this is just what people have approached me with. But when, as you know yourself, in studying this broader field, to me, the most compelling evidence, if we demand evidence of the supernatural, it is the enormous and historical body of testimony from people who have had these experiences. It is so enormous and so consistent in its character, broadly speaking, that I find that convincing. Convincing not necessarily that there's aliens here or that ghosts are real, but convincing that there is more to reality than the kind of, rigid skeptics would demand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we'll start wrapping up with this, but for people who want to find out more about you, maybe grab some of your books. Where do they learn about Andrew Pyper?
Well, if they want to sort of see me kind of rambling on about stuff, probably on Twitter at Andrew Pyper. So it's Andrew Pyper. Yeah. And if they're interested in my books, probably the best resource is my website, www.andrewpyper.com.
Yeah. In I mentioned earlier, your latest book involves the White House and a haunting. What's the story? Where did you come up with that idea?
I was Googling, I found myself in a rabbit hole. I was researching haunted houses just recreationally because it's just something I'm interested. I wasn't looking for a novel topic. Yeah. And I knew that the White House there's a certain amount of lore about the White House being haunted and stuff like that. But I thought it was a bit sort of silly. And I found President Franklin Pierce, who was a president I'd never heard of. Franklin Pierce. Either. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He was 2 presidents before Lincoln. And his wife, First Lady Jane Pierce, both of them lost all 3 of their children in a very short period of time just before his inauguration. So they entered the White House childless, tragically struck by this misfortune. And she moved into the second floor of the White House and refused to leave it, and spent all of her time writing letters to her dead son, Benny, pleading with him to come back to her. And according to her letters, which I was then, seeking out and reading, he did. She brought him back through conducting various kind of spiritual summonings and seances at the White House. And as soon as I read that, I thought, this is a novel. I have to write how does that affect him? Who is this woman? What's the nature of this marriage? Mm-hmm. It just drew me in. So there was a piece of real fact that I extrapolated into a fiction.
Yeah. So how do you do that? I guess that's what people would call like historical nonfiction. Is that the right genre? Like, I know like the idea of like taking a historical story and expanding it so it's a full narrative. Like, where is the line there between fiction and nonfiction?
Oh yeah, there's complicated names for it, and then there's obviously a whole genre of historical fiction where you have kind of the history to fiction might be a ratio of 90 to 10. Uh-huh. You might have here's the life of Churchill, and I'm gonna here's a scene where he's behind closed doors having a conversation, no one could know what. That's a very established genre. In the case of The Residents, my novel, it was more like 20 to 80, where we have these facts: this woman's loss, her letters, her belief that her dead son returned to her in material form, not as a ghost, but she was convinced he was there. And a few other curious facts about this marriage in this President Franklin, her husband, that I found strange. And so for me, it was a project of that 80% of turning those random curious pieces into a narrative that made emotional, psychological sense.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm on vacation next week. I'm going to get that book and bring it with me. Do you say the name of the latest is The Residents?
The Residents. Yeah.
Residents, like the house?
Yeah.
Or residents?
Yeah, that's what the residents mean the White House. So
okay.
Apparently in Washington, if you're an insider, you don't say White House, you say the Residents.
Okay. I'm not a Washington insider.
No, me neither.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you sharing the story of your experience at your cottage, but the story of that book sounds great too. So this is I got more than I bargained for.
Thanks, Jordan. I've had fun too.
Awesome, Andrew. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Cheers. Have a good one.
I want to thank you for joining Andrew and I in our discussion surrounding his UFO experience and the surprising effect it's had on his life. People can be quick to roll their eyes at stories like Andrew's, but I've spoke to enough people to know that seeing is believing. Well, believing may be the wrong word to use. Seeing is understanding. And with that, I'll end this episode of Nighttime. But before we part, I have some thanks. First, I want to thank Andrew Pyper for sharing his story with us. And if anyone listening wants to check out his work, I've added some links to where you can find him in the episode description. Next, a big thank you to Monty Datta for contributing the music to this episode. It's a piece called Noir Tokyo. And lastly, a massive thank you to everyone who listens to Nighttime, as without your interest and your support, this show would be as pointless as it would be impossible. But with that said, keeping the show alive is and has always been an uphill battle. So if you want to help take a bit of weight off the show's back, please subscribe to the premium feed. You can do so at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. And with that said, let me thank the newest supporters of the show. Jason, Brendan, Valerie, and Shauna, thank you for your generous support. And for anyone else who'd like to support the show but can't help financially, you can give me a big hand by simply sharing the episodes on social media and let like-minded friends know what we're doing here. If you have any story ideas or if you want to give feedback on the show, reach me at nighttimepodcast.com/contact or find me on social media. I use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and I'm often live on the Nighttime Podcast YouTube channel. So until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte. Copyright Jordan Bonaparte.